Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. The late John Green was unparalleled in his meticulous recording of sightings. Green was one of the best advocates for the creature known as Sasquatch to date. He was no biologist and never pretended to be, but with his master's degree in journalism, he was capable of comprehending large amounts of information from various fields, and he had a keen nose for nonsense. Open any page of any of his books, and you'll quickly determine that Green was a discerning man, more than capable of distinguishing between fiction and other, discerning between someone who is lying and someone who isn't. In his 50 years of chronicling Sasquatch human interactions, he recorded over 4,000 credible encounters of varying degrees. Of those 4,000 sightings, he said it took only 20 or so before he decided that there was a lot more to all this than mainstream science would accept or confess. In August 1969, Green interviewed a deputy sheriff from Grays Harbor, Washington State. The witness claimed he had a nighttime sighting in the early morning hours a month prior. The audio was never released as far as I'm aware, but I will read the text of the interview between John Green and the deputy sheriff, who saw a Sasquatch in the early hours of a summer morning. Obviously, I only have one voice to read the dialogue with, but hopefully the images and context are enough to tell who is saying what. To begin with, could we get your name on the tape? My name is Verlin Harrington. Where do you live? I live at Coppola's Beach, Washington. How old are you? 30 years old. And what is your occupation? I am a deputy sheriff for Grays Harbor County. Now the incident we've been discussing, could you give us the date when that took place? Yes, it was July 26th. It was on a Sunday. And the year? 1969. And what time? It was 2:35 a.m. What were you doing at that time? I had been on an incident at Hump Tulips, and I was en route by way of DK Road to the beach and into my residence. You were working at the time? Right. What was it that happened while you were making that trip? As I was going down DK Road, I rounded a corner, and my first impression was of a large bear standing in the middle of the road. I either had to stop for the bear or hit him, so I decided to stop and put on the brakes, came to a screeching halt, and coasted up the slight grade as far as I could, without startling the animal, as I was going towards it. This animal, in my opinion, was not a bear because you could see by the way it was standing that it had no snout. It had a face on it, its eyes reflected, and when I came to a complete stop, I could see in the headlights of my car that it had feet on it instead of paws, and it had breasts. When I centered my spotlight on the patrol car on it, it walked to the edge of the road. It didn't fall down on all fours like a bear would. It walked upright as a person would. It walked to the edge of the roadway and stopped, turned, still looking at me. I readjusted the spotlight on my car so I could look at it better. Its feet had hair down to the soles, but you could see the outline of the foot. It did have toes. Its hand was in a position where it was spread out, and it did have fingers. After I'd readjusted the spotlight, I rolled the window down, pulled my revolver, and crawled out of the door. I aimed my revolver at it, and as I cocked the hammer on it, the animal went into the brush. I got back in my car and drove off. Reported the next morning back to the scene and went through the area. Found where the animal had gone into the bush and where it had come back out onto the roadway. Did you find any tracks at all? Yes, I found one indentation in the ground. I did take a photograph of it. It wasn't such a print that you could pour a cast of. How big was it? I measured the track. It was 18.5 inches. The animal itself was around 7 to 7.5 feet tall, weighing approximately 300 to 325 pounds. How far away were you when you were looking at it? 75 to 80 feet. How long would you say you were able to observe it before it left the road? Approximately a minute and a quarter, maybe a minute and a half. This was from the time I came to a complete stop. I was observing it as I coasted towards it. So maybe overall 2 minutes. And in that time, it was standing erect on its hind legs? Yes, it was. As it went off into the brush, it was still on its hind legs. Where it went into the brush, that's down quite a steep little bank, isn't it? Yes, it is. And you could see that it remained erect as it went down the bank. Until it went out of the spotlight, yes. Had it started to descend the bank in the spotlight, or was it gone from the spotlight? It went down the bank, and approximately halfway down, it went out of the spotlight, still in an erect position. Just sort of go over it from top to bottom. Can you tell us anything about the shape of the head? For instance, your first impression was a bear. Did it have a snout? No, it didn't have a snout. I couldn't say that it has a nose like a person would have. I believe that there was no hair on its face. It had a dark, leathery look. Did you get any impression of the length of hair on the head or on the rest of it? I would say about 3 to 4 inches on the head. It didn't have long, hanging hair at all? Longer on the head than the body, yes. What sort of neck did it have? No neck. You mentioned, I think, that it had breasts? Yes. Where on the body were they located? Like a human person, they were also covered with hair except for the nipples, and they were skin. Did you mention the color of the hair? No, I didn't. It was brownish-black. Dark-colored. You say you saw a hand with the fingers extended. Yes. Could you tell us how long the arms were? I would have to guess at how long they were. The arm that I was looking at was in a bent position, like when you catch someone startled. You couldn't at any time see how far down the body the arm would come? No. Comparing it to a human, would you say that it had long legs or short legs? Long legs. I would say long, muscular legs. Did it take long strides? No. It seemed like it took small steps as it walked. It was watching me as it walked to the edge of the road. They would be large steps for a normal human, but for this animal, they were short steps. About 3 steps from the center of the road to the edge. Did you notice any difference in the way it walked and the way a human would walk? Same type of position, and same type of walk as a human being. Any other details that you can recall that you noticed about it? That pretty well covers it. You didn't see the teeth, I guess. No. Did it taper at the waist? Did it have a narrow waist? It was a big body, a big, stout body. That's the best I remember it was. It could have been thinner at the waist, I don't remember. It was pretty heavily built. Yes. About a week after the interview, the deputy made a public statement saying that he was mistaken and that he saw a bear. A black bear, specifically. You ever get one of those from your boss? But you will if you want to keep your job. But I'm more curious about the conversation between the witness's boss's 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 boss and his boss. As far as I can tell, the Polaroid that the deputy sheriff took disappeared. Green always tried to have specialists in related fields present for such interviews, and this one was no exception. 2 physical anthropologists from Washington State University were present for the interview. It was their opinion that the deputy sheriff was sober, lucid, and truthful as best as they could tell. Though they did notice, as did Green, that the witness didn't really seem inclined to say much. Almost as if he had begun to regret this interview. Like getting him to elaborate was kind of like pulling teeth. And perhaps for good reason, considering his following inadequate retraction. Even in the hazy world of Bigfoot research, this report is not perfect. The report has several variances from what is typical of a nighttime roadside sighting. No deal breakers, just variances from what is typical. First, that the encounter lasted between 1 minute and 30 seconds and 2 minutes. That's a long time. He sees it in the middle of the road. His very first impression is that it's a bear. He slams the brakes and pulls over, already confident it isn't a bear by that point. As he is focusing his spotlight, it's still in the middle of the road, looking at him. He gets his light on it, and it walks over to the side of the road in 3 steps. He crawls out the passenger side door to refocus the spotlight. It's still looking at him. Only once he pulls his weapon does it disappear down into the forest. Timeline-wise, I suppose a minute and a half or 2 minutes makes sense, but I can't imagine why the creature would linger so long, when it could have just as easily have fled at the sight of the headlights. Then this sighting would be more typical. In my opinion, Sasquatch is a creature defined by its extreme competency in reducing risk, which we just don't see in this report. But human beings, at least, do weird, risky things for no reason all the time. Perhaps Sasquatch are no exception. Or maybe he saw the Patterson creature itself. And half the Bigfoot sightings in the Northwest can be attributed to the worst Bigfoot in history. Speaking of which, the second imperfection or inconsistency in this report is the deputy's description of how the creature walked. He calls it a, quote, human-type walk. Green even asks specifically if he noticed a, quote, difference in the way it walked and the way a human would walk. And the deputy answers, same type of position and same type of walk as a human being. Typically, from a few witnesses I've spoken with, as well as the lion's share of reports, people typically are struck by how inhuman the walk is. A more elliptical motion, or cross-country skiing mechanic, with a low butt, indicative of bent knees, reliant on a musculature more suited for explosive expenditure rather than consistent long-distance travel. A more reflexive locomotion system, less reliant on arched feet and lockable knees, as we are. So why simply, same type of walk as a human being? Maybe the deputy simply thought the Sasquatch walk is close enough to a human gait as to not notice distinctions. Though he does describe the arms as in a bent position and never falling to the side and straight down. So arm motion is consistent. Also, the witness said, quote, it seemed like it took small steps as it walked. It was watching me as it walked to the edge of the road. They would be large steps for a normal human, but for this animal, they were short steps. About 3 steps from the center of the road to the edge. Again, typically, we think of these creatures as taking long strides, which brings up an interesting point. Let's say Deputy Sheriff Verlin Harrington made up his story. It's a complete lie, and he just wanted to get some attention from the Bigfoot world, and wanted to be in the presence of someone like John Green, which seems unlikely seeing as he didn't seem to have much to say. But if that was the case, I imagine he would have watched the Patterson-Gimlin film, or looked at the stills, some 8,000 times in the 2 years it would have been available before his sighting. He would have been very well read on the matter, especially living in Washington state. So then why is the creature he describes so inconsistent with the Patterson creature? The film's most discussed subject is the creature's gait, and the deputy sheriff had little more to say than it walked like a person. Perhaps whatever he saw just looked human enough to him. The fact that the creature he reported was taking small steps doesn't bother me, because the creature, for one reason or another, was clearly in no hurry. The creature he saw was taking its time. So why it took small steps, and why this un-Bigfooty characteristic would be described were the story made up, is curious. But the final imperfection in this narrative has nothing to do with the creature, but rather the witness's narrative of the creature. His narrative offers no personal element whatsoever. He doesn't give one adjective about how he felt, nor does he state his attitude regarding Sasquatch, before or after his sighting. There is no, I had heard of sightings but never give it much thought, or, I thought Bigfoot was nonsense until that night, or, I had friends with sightings, so I was always on the lookout. Nothing like that. It just seems odd that someone would seek out one of the most reputable names in Bigfoot and then not have that much to say on the matter. That certainly is not the behavior we would expect from someone seeking their moment of fame in this bizarre subject. But in my opinion, some of the best Bigfoot sightings come from people who don't so much care about Bigfoot. In fact, The deputy sheriff doesn't say the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch once, which in my experience occurs with people who have had a sighting but have yet to jump down the rabbit hole, so to speak. Green and his academic observers noted a distinct lack of enthusiasm from the witness. Why? Well, perhaps he wasn't very enthusiastic. And I get it. It is unreasonable for us to expect everyone with a Sasquatch sighting to passionately spring to their feet and start replicating a compliant gait. Or maybe even sightings of this nature are so commonplace in his Washington region that he wasn't even that surprised. You could say there are reasons to not believe this witness. But I wasn't there, and John Green was. And he believed him. Even the two skeptics present said the witness wasn't noticeably delirious or obviously deceptive. So I'll take that as a modest victory, though with little meaning. John Green is one of the few people in this field of such upstanding character and quality that he has largely been spared the criticisms of skeptics and advocates alike. But the skeptic could always say that this was just another attempt at John Green getting some publicity to sell his books. Green received his master's degree in journalism at Columbia in New York. He then went into the Navy in the late 40s and began his journalism career in the early 50s. To say he was just trying to sell books seems odd to me. He had his master's in journalism, and there were plenty of topics that he could have been covering in his early life and times. Topics with a lot larger dollar signs than Bigfoot. Topics with a lot more appeal, and a lot more substance for content. And a man of his skill set and dedication surely could have gone far with any of them. In short, if John Green was just trying to sell books, I don't think he would have wrote them about Bigfoot. Because this field has no path of least resistance, and it never will. The path of least resistance is to turn around and dismiss the whole thing. And even as the years became decades, and the decades became the better half of a century, I don't believe his hope ever fully broke. But it's sad he never got his big story. Anyway, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.